As an attorney, and especially a Jewish attorney, I don't think there's any program that I've been involved with that is so impactful as Project Nuremberg. We all really leave with a sense of community, a sense of belonging. We learn so much, and we're so inspired by the speakers and those that we've honored. And it's just a really fantastic way to come together. And I really do feel each year we leave more transformed and more connected to our Jewish heritage.
Understanding the impact that Nuremberg has today on continuing to combat anti-Semitism, continuing to combat crimes against humanity, unfortunately, they still go on, and they still continue to this day, from the Holocaust to present day. So you don't just have to be an attorney to be involved in the project, to be exposed to this amazing content. Anyone that is involved in current events, is interested in politics, is interested in history, this is also a place for you.
You had a Europe that was ravaged by World War II. You had millions and millions of people who died. You had 6 million Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. It was a really broken world. And the Nuremberg trials said, we have to figure out how to go forward, but we're going to do it with law and in a way that makes sense and that is ethical and moral and the exact opposite of what the Nazis did. For over a decade, the Project Nuremberg Luncheon has taken place here at Temple Beth El of Boca Raton, but with the pandemic, we've had the need to move online and create this incredible program called Project Nuremberg Online.
And while we are planning and hoping to be together in 2022 and get back to a live event, we did not want to take any time off or miss a beat, and this is going to expand the programming and the availability to so many even more people. And so I really hope people will take advantage of it and watch.
We give CLEs, we give these continuing legal education credits as a statement to the attorneys that your time is important to us, and we want you to leave here not just with these CLEs, but really transformed in understanding how incredible your field is and was in bringing order to a chaotic world.
Even if you don't practice in criminal law or international law, having a general historic sense of one of the most important tribunals in recent history will give you perspective into all areas of law and the passion that you need to bring, whether it's arguing in a civil case or negotiating a real estate contract.
Our programs have been so important.
Oh, they are.
And so critical. Just last year, we had the oldest living prosecutor in Nuremberg as our guest speaker. And he left us with a line that I think I'll never forget, when he said, "Law and not war is what will save the world."
Many, many years ago, when Alan Dershowitz spoke, and because this was a legal event and he was such an icon in the legal industry and a professor and an academic, I thought that was a wonderful program, and I think that really helped to give the program its wings and to make it the premier legal event moving forward in our community.
I think Project Nuremberg Online is important to the world at large because there's still hate in the world. And I think that the speakers that we are bringing in are the people that remind us that when confronted with hate, you don't shirk away, that you go to battle and you confront it and you figure out a way to change a wrong to a right and make the world a better place.
Really, it's basically to educate our children and grandchildren and future generations about man's inhumanity to mankind. And we just can't afford to repeat this in the future, so we have to all be together on this and fight hard in any way we can to save the future of the Jewish people.
The people who perpetuate hate and anti-Semitism and racism are bullies, and they use scare tactics. And I think that the people that we bring to you with Project Nuremberg are the people who stand up to the bullies and say, don't back down. Really there's a battle to be fought here, and it's a battle for good over evil. Good morning. I am Rabbi Jessica Spitalnic Mates of Temple Beth of Boca Raton. I'm here with Jay Weinberg, who, along with his wife Marilyn, are underwriters for Project Nuremberg. And we are in awe to be with you together today with a group of people that are literally around the world, in Israel, in Vienna, in other parts of Europe, to be with us today to mark the 75th anniversary of the end of the Nuremberg trials. They ended with sentencing. They ended with the complexity of taking this big question of how you take the horrors that happened during the Holocaust and figure out how to go forward. And it is the rule of law that propelled us forward. 2 weeks after the end of the trials, when those who had been sentenced to hanging were going to be hanged, the night before that, Hermann Goering, through his wife or through an American guard, has never been discovered how, was slipped a cyanide capsule and took his own life rather than dying at the hands of justice that was being carried out the next morning. We have also taken the Nuremberg trials into our own hands, not to do the dark and the painful and the awful and the destructive, but to do the opposite, to show that these events of 75 years ago have echoes that exist till this very day in our world. And we are so honored that you've joined us this morning on the 75th anniversary with the most illustrious, wise, and brilliant set of speakers you will hear to talk about those trials, particularly Professor Philippe Sands, who is just a marvel of a man whose own life personally and professionally is tied up with all of this. But before you meet them all, a couple of thank yous that we would like to say. We want to thank Leslie Weiselman and our partners in the Southeast Regional Office of the American Friends of Hebrew University, who have been our partners for this event, and we so appreciate their involvement. We want to thank, and we'll set up on the screen the slide that sponsors them, our Project Nuremberg online sponsors, Michael J. Gelfand of Gelfand and RPA, Howard Guggenheim, Jan and Alan Lev, Barbara Orville, Natalie Palavin, and Ellen and Robert Yerman, who have been sponsors when we had to make this difficult decision to move from our in-person luncheon, which has hundreds and hundreds of attorneys and others in the community, and move online. And we have done it thanks to them. And we also are forever indebted to Jay and Marilyn Weinberg, and we'll bring up the slide with them now. They have been, with passion and grace and dignity and love, the underwriters of Project Nuremberg for so many years, over a decade here at Temple Bethel, and without which we couldn't do any of this. And we are so appreciative to each and every one of them for that. For those of you who are attorneys, we remind you that there are CLEs for this event. We'll show the slide with the CLEs now and again at the end of the session. And you will see the number on the screen that is there for you. It is one general CLE credit, 2107233N. And we are indebted to the Florida Bar that they make us and these events, CLE events. And we are so appreciative for their support in all this. And also, of course, to Lynn University, where the Blue Series that I rescued 13 years ago from destruction live now. They belong to Robert Jackson, who is the Supreme Court Justice, who is the head of the trials. And we are lucky to have that bit of history with us in South Florida. And now we are traveling to Israel, where we will meet Professor Daphna Lewinsohn-Zamir, who is the Dean of Hebrew University Law School and has been our partner in this event. Professor Lewinsohn-Zamir, over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I wish I could meet you face to face, but this is currently impossible, so I'm grateful for this virtual get-together. I want to first thank the American Friends of the Hebrew University and Rabbi Jessica Spitalnic Mate of Temple Beth El for organizing what promises to be a terrific event. I'm eager to hear the conversation between Professor Philippe Sands and Professors Yuval, Shany, and Renana Kedar, so my remarks will be brief. It will not surprise you if I say that we are living in very challenging times. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted and intensified social divides in many countries, including Israel and the United States. An increased civil unrest has regrettably led to conflict and violence, both within and between societies. Governments all over the world are seeking ways to deal with this situation. So the topic of today's conversation, keeping alive the lessons of the Nuremberg trials, is of utmost importance. The law faculty of the Hebrew University is the flagship of legal research and education in Israel. For instance, according to the latest Shanghai International Ranking of Law Schools, we are not only ranked first in Israel, but also 30th in the entire world. And one of the main missions of the law faculty is to offer our students the strongest, most cutting-edge legal education. Our curriculum puts an emphasis on human rights, and our Clinical Legal Education Center teaches students how social responsibility is an integral part of the legal profession. I want to briefly mention two recent accomplishments that will enhance our activities in the field of human rights and promote people's welfare, both academically and in practice. First, the Alfred Landecker Foundation has established at the university the Landecker-Ferenc Chair in the study of protection of minorities and vulnerable groups. Second, our Minerva Center of Human Rights has won a prestigious grant from the Botnar Foundation to establish a chair and a unique program in children and youth rights. It will be the first program of its kind in Israel and is certain to advance the welfare of the most vulnerable groups in our society. Turning to today's event, I'm honored that Professor Philippe Sands, a renowned expert on international law, including Holocaust studies and the Nuremberg trials, has kindly agreed to share his thoughts and insights with us. And I'm also delighted that Professors Yuval, Shany, and Renana Kedar of our faculty will join Professor Sands in the discussion. And I will introduce both of them briefly. Without doubt, Professor Yuval Shany is one of the stars of our faculty. He holds the Hersh Lauterbach Chair in Public International Law, and is a leading scholar in the areas of public international law, international human rights, and international courts and tribunals. Yuval has written his doctoral dissertation at the University of London under the supervision of Professor Sands, and has since published numerous books and articles. He has fulfilled many leadership roles in both Israel and abroad, including chair of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, dean of the law faculty, academic director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights, and academic director of our Clinical Legal Education Center. Dr. Renana Kedar is a rising star, both in the law faculty and the Faculty of Humanities. She holds degrees in law and political science from Israel and a PhD in comparative literature from Stanford University. At the Hebrew University, Renana heads the Alfred Landecker Digital Humanities Lab and is both founder and director of the teaching program in digital humanities. She has won several prestigious fellowships, including the Alon and the Martin Buber fellowships. In her research, she employs cutting-edge theories and sophisticated empirical methods to study testimonies from international criminal courts in cases involving mass atrocities, including Holocaust testimonies. So without further ado, let me pass on the virtual microphone to Mr. Jane Weinberg, who will introduce Professor Sands. Thank you all for your attention and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much. And let me extend a warm welcome to each of us attending this event marking the 75th anniversary of the end of the Nuremberg trials. God's angels have smiled most pleasingly on us this morning, affording us an opportunity to hear an address by Professor Philippe Sands, a renowned legal scholar. Professor Sands joined the University College London faculty in January of 2002. He is a professor of law and director of the Center of International Courts and Tribunals in the faculty, and a key member of the staff of the Center for Law and the Environment.
Professor Sands is a regular commentator on BBC and CNN. He is frequently invited to lecture around the world, and in recent years has been a visiting professor at Hebrew University. He previously held academic positions at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, King's College London, and the University of Cambridge, and was a global scholar of law at New York University from 1995 to 2003. As a practicing barrister, he has extensive experience litigating cases before the International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes and the European Court of Justice. He frequently advises governments, international organizations, and the private sector on aspects of international law. In 2003, he was appointed a Queen's Counsel and is the author of many books, including East-West Street and The Rat Line, The Exalted Life and Mysterious Death of Nazi Fugitives. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Sands to address our audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's wonderful to be with Temple Bethel. Jay and Marilyn, I just pay tribute to your support for this program. Project Nuremberg is extraordinarily important, and we are exactly at the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. I've just returned from a trip to the Ukraine. I was in Kiev on the anniversary of the terrible events at Babin Yar, the 80th anniversary. Then I spent 3 days in the city of Lviv, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. And I'm right now in Vienna, about to give a presentation this week on the Rat Line in, if you like, the city of its origins, which will be, I suspect, quite interesting. I'm delighted to be with you. Nuremberg has been part of my life. I am the son of a Holocaust survivor. My mother was a hidden child in Paris. She was born in Vienna 3 months after the Anschluss, and she was smuggled to safety in Paris and hidden for 4.5 years. And I'm delighted to say is alive and well, and I'm very close to her. But it became part of my life also, the Nuremberg trials, when I became a law student. In our first class on international law, way back in 1981, mention was of course made of Nuremberg. I went on to do further studies. And then starting in the late 1990s, and in particular in 1998, I had not only been teaching about international criminal law in Nuremberg, but I had also been active in doing some cases. Then in 1998, I became involved in drafting the statute of the International Criminal Court, and then in the proceedings in London on Senator Augusto Pinochet and whether he was entitled to claim immunity from the jurisdiction of the English courts. And I became increasingly involved in a whole raft of different cases. In 2010, somewhat out of the blue, I received an invitation to give a lecture on the cases that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide: Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Chile, Argentina, and the cases go on around the world. You're all very familiar with this unfortunate and long list. Robert Jackson said in his opening address 76 years ago, never again, but regrettably, that hasn't quite been what happened. But I come to the city of Lviv to deliver a lecture on the cases that I'd been involved in. And I accepted, not because I wanted to give a lecture so much, but because I wanted to go to Lviv. Lviv is the same city as Lvov and Lemberg. And I wanted to go there because my grandfather was born there in 1904. By the time I knew him in the 1960s, he was a Frenchman. He lived in Paris, and I was very close to him until he died in 1997. But he never talked to me about what had happened during the war period and in that early life, in the years in Vienna and before that, in Lemberg. So I thought I'll go to Lemberg and try to find the house where he was born. And it was really an act of identity to understand my grandfather better as a way of understanding myself better. I prepared my lecture and I stumbled across, somewhat accidentally, I have to say, a remarkable double discovery. First, that the man who put the concept of crimes against humanity into international law in the summer of 1945 in the drafting of the Nuremberg Statute was Hersch Lauterpacht. Yuval Shany has his chair at the Hebrew University. Hersch Lauterpacht, probably the greatest international lawyer of the 20th century, but remarkably also a resident, like my grandfather, of Lemberg, Lviv. He studied at the law faculty in Lemberg from 1915 to 1919 and eventually went to Vienna and ended up as professor of law at Cambridge University. I found it remarkable that I'd received this invitation and discovered what was not known, that the origins of crimes against humanity could be traced not only to the Nuremberg Statute, because those words crimes against humanity appeared in international law for the first time in the Nuremberg Statute, but in the work of Hersch Lauterpacht and could be traced to the city of Lemberg. I thought that was remarkable enough. Then I discovered that the man who invented the word genocide, literally invented it, which was also introduced not into the Nuremberg Statute, but into the Nuremberg indictment in October 1945, also came from the city of Lemberg, Lviv, also studied at the same law faculty, not quite at the same time as Hersch Lauterpacht. He arrived in 1921 and 1926. And of course, his name is rather more familiar to many of you. His name was Raphael Lemkin. How amazing, I thought, that you could trace the origins of crimes against humanity and genocide to the city of Lemberg, my grandfather's city. I carried on doing the research, and I discovered that Lauterpacht and Lemkin had both been parts of the prosecution teams in the famous Nuremberg trial that we're commemorating today. Lauterpacht was with the British delegation, prosecuting defendants for crimes against humanity. Lemkin was with the American delegation, prosecuting for the crime of genocide. In the dock was the fourth man in the story that I wrote in my book, East-West Street, Hans Frank, Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, on whose territory most of the extermination camps were found. He'd been a lawyer. He'd been Adolf Hitler's lawyer from 1928 to 1933, and now he was charged with crimes against humanity and genocide. And what struck me as most remarkable, of course, and as a lawyer, Jay, I'm sure you will have the same sentiment as I do, when Lauterpacht and Lemkin were involved in the trial in its early days, they were not aware that the man they were prosecuting was the man responsible for the murder of their entire families, and of course, my grandfather's entire family in Lviv and the nearby town of Zhovkva, where I was indeed yesterday morning at the mass grave, where still today the families of Lauterpacht and my grandfather rest together. That story I told in East-West Street, but in writing the story, I came to know the son of Hans Frank. His name is Nicholas Frank, and he is a remarkable person. He published a book in the late 1980s in Germany called The Father, which was a rather coruscatingly vicious attack on his father, whom he considered to be a criminal. And the very first time I met Nicholas said to me, Philippe, you must understand that I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father. Very powerful words. Nick and I got to know each other. And one day Nicholas said to me, Philippe, your origins are from Lemberg. The governor of Lemberg was Otto Vesta. It was on his watch that 500,000 Jews and Poles were exterminated from and around that city. Would you like to meet his son, Horst? And I said, sure. I'm not sure why he would want to meet me, but let's give it a go. A year later, we're now in early 2012, Nicholas and I met in the small town of Hagenberg. I'm speaking to you today from Vienna. I will be seeing Horst Wächter again on Tuesday and on Wednesday here in this city, talking about the book that I wrote that followed from that encounter, The Rat Line. One thing led to another. I liked Horst, but I didn't like the views that he expounded, which were to defend his father. Horst is not a Holocaust denier. Horst is not a racist. He is not an anti-Semite. But, as he says to me frequently, I am trying to find the good in my father. His father was indicted for mass murder. But on the 9th of May, 1945, when the war in Europe ended, he escaped and he was never caught. I wanted to know what happened to Otto Wächter. And as a consequence of a film that Nicholas, Horst, and I made, which any of you can watch on Amazon or Apple TV or whatever, My Nazi Legacy, there was a moment where Horst got rather upset, where Nicholas got rather upset with Horst and accused Horst of being a new kind of Nazi. I intervened. I said I didn't think Horst was a new or old kind of Nazi. He was, I think, a victim of those terrible events of 80 years ago, who was having trouble, frankly, dealing with the realities of what his father, who had overseen mass murder, had done. Horst said to me, Philippe, how can I prove I'm not a Nazi? Now, again, Jay is a lawyer, and the other lawyers on this conversation will understand that proving a negative in court and in life is not always quite so easy. I thought about this question, and eventually I came up with an answer. I said to Horst, you've shown me 3 or 4 pages of your family archive. You've shown me photographs, you've shown me a few letters, you've shown me a few extracts of your mother Charlotte's diaries. She had met Otto Wächter in 1929, and they were married 3 years later and lived together until 1949 as husband and wife, when Wächter died in mysterious circumstances in a Vatican-run hospital in Rome. You've got 10,000 pages of documents. You refer to them very often. I suggested to him, why don't you give those documents to a museum? Nazis tend not to give these kinds of things to museums, and this will be a way of establishing and showing your bona fides, your good faith. And Horst said, terrific idea, which museum? And I said, well, the one that I think would treat the material, digitize it and make it available, and it is now available on the web, you can go and see it, is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And Horst said, done, deal, I'm going to do it. And he did it, and I credit him that. And the material, as I say, is now all available. That's back in 2014, 2015. Before it had become publicly available, at the time that it was being digitized, Horst said to me, would you like a copy, Philippe? And I said, I'd love to have a copy. And 2 weeks later, through my letterbox in London, arrived a tatty old used envelope containing a single USB stick with 10,000 pages of documents from 1929 until 1949. Remarkable material, unique material, material of a kind that has never before been seen. Material that allows you to trace the relationship between Charlotte and Otto Wächter from the moment they met on the 6th of April, 1929, until the moment he died on the 13th of July, 1949. Through his rise in the Austrian Nazi Party band, his involvement in the murder of the Austrian Chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, his fleeing to Berlin, his working in the SD division of the SS as a criminal lawyer under the tutelage of Heinrich Himmler, who would become his mentor, working also in the same office as Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, through to his return to Vienna, where I am now, standing on the Heldenplatz balcony about 2 meters from Adolf Hitler on that terrible day in March 1938, through to his appointment as governor of Krakow, the construction of the Krakow ghetto, through to his appointment as governor of District Galicia and his appointment in Lemberg, which he fled in the summer of 1944 when the Red Army reoccupied Lemberg, through to his escape. And it tells a remarkable story, not just in the period of coming to power and being in power, but in the period after. Because for the first time, we have a detailed account of what happened in the period from May 1945 until July 1949. How he escaped, who helped him, who the networks were, and most dramatically of all, and I don't want to give everything away, I write about it in my book, The Rat Line, and it's available also on a BBC podcast, which you can listen to. Just type in BBC The Rat Line, and you will be able to listen to a 10-part series and hear all of these characters, including people like the writer John le Carré. You will be able to go onto this material and learn the remarkable story of what happened. And I'm going to end on the legacy of Nuremberg with a single fact that I found deeply shocking. Otto Vesta arrived in Rome on the 29th of April, 1949. He was on the run. He was terrified that he would be caught, that he would be tried, that he would be convicted and face the fate of all of his senior colleagues, sentenced to death. I have no doubt, and I've said this to Horst many times, if your father had been caught, he would have been sentenced to death. He wasn't caught. He died in mysterious circumstances. And it is that story which I've been able to tell in The Rat Line. And most disturbingly for me is the fact that on the day he arrived in Rome, on April the 29th, 1949, to be met by a senior Austrian bishop, the same bishop who would help Mengele and Klaus Barbie and Priebke and various others escape on the rat line to Argentina. That bishop was an American spy. And that bishop informed the Americans that Vesta had arrived in Rome, what his false identity was, Alfredo Reinhardt, and where he could be found. And the Americans and the British and the Allies did nothing about it, because by 1949, the Nuremberg legacy was over. And there was a new enemy. And the new enemy was the Soviets. And extraordinarily, we knew it in relation to Werner von Braun, the scientist who designed the V-2 rockets, who was recruited by the Allies. The Allies now recruited SS mass murderers in the new struggle against the Soviets. That's not the whole story of the Rat Line. I tell the story of love between a Nazi couple, both rabid anti-Semites, and the story of justice and injustice, the failure to apprehend them, and the continuing networks between fascists and old Nazis and certain people in the Vatican and certain people in the administrations of the Allies. It was an eye-opener, I have to say. But it reminded me of the fundamental importance of the Nuremberg legacy. Exactly as Jay said, this was the first time in human history that individuals have been put on trial for acts committed in the name of a state before an international tribunal. But it was, in many respects, lopsided justice. And that system of justice for 50 years after Nuremberg fell into abeyance until the 1990s. It then picked up again. But one of the extraordinary legacies of Nuremberg is that it gave us crimes against humanity and genocide. Another is that it gave us a system of rules for bringing perpetrators to justice, conventions like the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide of 1948. But it also reminds us that justice, in the Nuremberg sense, is not a one-way street. It cannot be lopsided. I'll finish with a single salutary reminder about what concerns me. I am, I think, as you will all know, I'm so grateful to Rabbi Jessica for this invitation. It's a real privilege to be here. A true and total supporter of the Nuremberg principles and the Nuremberg justice system. But I am worried. If you, after this call, go onto the website of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, you will see that since it came into being in 1998 and started to operate in 2002, 46 individuals have been identified as defendants and 30 proceedings have begun. Every single one of those people is Black and is from Africa. And Blacks and Africans do not have a monopoly on international crime. And I'm concerned that one of the legacies of Nuremberg might be that it will come to be seen as a system that has been created which allows the powerful to ensnare the weak. And that's why I think we have to go back to the origins of the Nuremberg ideal, which is that no one is above the law, whether they come from a weak country or a powerful country, whether they act in whatever capacity. All of us, myself included, are subject to the Nuremberg principles. I end with that note. Remarkable strides have been made in 75 years. We honor the Nuremberg judgment. We honor the principles that it set forth. We honor the legacy, but let us go forward and constantly seek to improve as we go forward. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's an incredible pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. As a scholar of law and literature, and also just as an avid reader of your writings, I have to say that your amazing capability to make history and a complex legal history, no less, come into life is really inspiring. So it's always just a sheer pleasure to hear you talk. And I think I heard you talk in another conversation about your new title in the law school, and I believe it very much fits this vision that you have about how important it is to make justice accessible, also by telling the story of justice and the story of injustice when it needs be. I want to, I know you took us all the way to current affairs and to the ICC, and I'm sure Yuval will also pick up on that later on, but I want to go back a little bit to my own research and ask you a question from there. So in my research, I tried to trace the trajectory of Nuremberg and its impact, the impact of its legacy on the current treatment of mass atrocity. And what I find myself pondering often is not only about the continuity or the the lasting impact of the trial's grand narrative, enlightenment, anti-revenge, but also the frictions and absences in this history, especially in regards to the Holocaust. And I will explain. The Nuremberg Tribunal is often portrayed also in your talks and in your writing as an integral part of the story in which Jews, as the ultimate victims, are involved as the prosecutors in the post-war justice effort. And as you just mentioned now in the beginning of your talk, this is very much the story that you tell so beautifully in East-West Street, an amazing book. But the truth is that Nuremberg was not so much about the Holocaust, and that it's often argued actually that the Eichmann trial, on which I also wrote, and also we celebrate its anniversary now too, was in fact the first great Holocaust trial, if you want, even nicknamed sometimes the Jewish Nuremberg. And at the heart of Nuremberg was not so much the Holocaust and not even crimes against humanity, even though it was there in the books, but rather the crime of aggression. And my question to you now is, what do you think history says about this choice of Prosecutor Jackson, the American prosecutor in Nuremberg, to concentrate on aggression, which only now is finally recognized as a legal norm, and will probably take some more time before it actually makes an impact in the field of international criminal law?
Thank you, Renana. And can I just begin by saying how lovely it is to be on this call with you, and how intensely jealous I am that you got to do a PhD in comparative literature. I wish I had done that, because it just makes you a more rounded and better lawyer. I am absolutely sure. I am very jealous of that. I think you'll know you're pushing at an open door. I mean, the Nuremberg trial was essentially not about crimes against humanity and genocide. If you look at the amount of time spent on the arguments of the prosecutors and the witnesses and so on and so forth. It was really about proving that the Germans, had waged an illegal war. But of course, it did deal also with these other crimes, and it came to some very important findings. But there are some really interesting aspects about that. That was a tactical decision. And a couple of people have written articles. I love criticism. I love being told I've got things wrong and whatever, criticizing East West Street on the grounds that, it misses the point. The Nuremberg trial was all about aggression. The critique misses the point. I totally know that. I totally accept that. I'm telling a micro story within the trial. And I'm in complete agreement with you. That was a strategic decision taken at that moment in 1945, I suspect largely because it was the issue on which the Allies would be subject to least amounts of disagreement. If you take, for example, the mass murder at Katyn, for which the Germans were prosecuted unbelievably at Nuremberg, even though a lot of people will have known the Soviets were behind that. So I suspect that was the reason why. It was the easiest way to get the four countries together and pushing mostly in the same direction.
Philippe, if I may jump in here, it's great to
always
see.
Jump in, lovely Yuval, always, yeah.
Yeah. We're not so far apart. I'm speaking from Geneva. I want to zoom out, pick up what Renana just said and zoom out just a little bit. So it's true that there were the crimes which were prosecuted in Nuremberg, and there has been some tug of war as to how to frame the trial. But I think perhaps one of the most important and impressive aspects of the trial that it has come to symbolize the rule of law, like you just said in your ending remark. And you have this wonderful speech by Jackson in the beginning of the trial about the tribute that power is paid to reason, and basically subjecting the enemies to the judgment of the law. So I'm speaking to you as the person who wrote 15 years ago a book that's called Lawless World. And I'm asking you whether, in hindsight, how do you think we stand on that perhaps larger agenda of Nuremberg, which is, basically subjecting to some extent international politics to the rule of law? Your plea at the end of your speech suggests that maybe we aren't doing so great in this trajectory.
Right. Well, I'm going to come to that, Yuval, I promise, but I do want to just come back to Renana's, because there is an aspect of it that many of the viewers will not be aware about. It is right that the terrible atrocities and killings perpetrated against Jewish communities across occupied Europe were not really the central focus of the trial. They were there, but they were not a focus, not only as a political matter. If we deep dive into the micro, I've dealt with Hirsch Lauterpacht as one of the four characters in my book. It's really fascinating to read the draft speeches that Lauterpacht wrote for the British prosecutor Hartley Shawcross, because you will find in his draft 76-page closing arguments almost no reference to what happened to the Jews. Why? I think Lauterpacht believed that if he made it about the Jews, he would be accused of acting in his own interest. And I think he took a strategic decision, and I think it was the right decision. I don't criticize him for it. That he would get certain principles established by looking at atrocities against a range of different communities and characters, and not put the accent on the Jewish community. And I think, in a sense, the same was with Lemkin, who always focused also on the Poles and on the Roma, and never focused exclusively on the Jews. The fact that two Jewish guys from Lviv are the originators of these ideas, I think they understood we need to be careful how we push this forward. And it's also very interesting, and people don't generally know, if you read the entirety of the judgment of Nuremberg, the famous trial, the International Military Tribunal, the judgment that came out 75 years ago this week, you will not find the word genocide mentioned. They did not find that there was a genocide of the Jews. People always say, oh yeah, genocide of the Jews, it was found at Nuremberg. No, it wasn't. They didn't do it. And they didn't do it because the Americans did not want to use the word genocide. Robert Jackson never uttered the word genocide in court. Why? Because he was concerned that Southern American senators would come down on him like a ton of bricks in relation to the treatment of blacks in the United States, lynchings and various other things, and because the treatment of the Native American populations would come to the fore and they would claim genocide also. So the politics of words, the politics of crimes becomes extremely sensitive. Now, those sensitivities we see right now, Yuval, in relation to Lawless World. I wrote Lawless World in the aftermath of the war in Iraq. I was horrified by what happened in Iraq. Let me just say, Jay had mentioned I'd been at NYU. I was in New York on September the 11th. I was in, Washington Square. I saw the towers. I was there. I smelt the burning. It is ingrained in my being. I feel the horror just talking about it. But the reaction to 9/11 has been, in terms of law, a total catastrophe. And it has undone the reputations of the two countries that did so much to create the Nuremberg moment. That is the United States and the United Kingdom, because it led to a period of complete lawlessness. Lawlessness in terms of waging war in Iraq, lawlessness in terms of embracing torture, which I deeply regret the United States did in that particular period, and lawlessness now going forward. These two countries, the United Kingdom and the United States, purport to be the guardians of the rule of law. We've just celebrated the 5th anniversary of a case I was involved in, Yuval. You know it, the South China Seas case. I was counsel for the Philippines against China in relation to its violations of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And we achieved from the Law of the Sea Arbitral Tribunal a unanimous award that China was in manifest violation of the Law of the Sea Tribunal. And Secretary of State Blinken invoked that just a few days ago and called on China to comply with the ruling. But what about the United Kingdom and the United States? They maintain a base at a place most people have never even heard of, although it was a place of extraordinary rendition, Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is part of a set of islands called the Chagos Archipelago, which was part of the British colony of Mauritius. And 2 years ago, the International Court of Justice, in an advisory opinion, determined that that separation of Mauritius and Chagos was unlawful, and that the British occupation of the Chagos Archipelago is unlawful. What has been the reaction of the United Kingdom and the United States? They are now totally isolated in the world, except that they are supported by a couple of countries, Australia and Israel, the only two countries in the world that are supporting that act of lawlessness in not recognizing the occupation of that island is an internationally illegal act under the Law of the Sea Convention. I don't celebrate this. I am counsel for Mauritius. I declare my interest in that case. What I think is that it is tragic that the two countries that have done so much for the rule of law in the international domain are now, in effect, slowly withdrawing from it. Now, President Biden is trying, I think, but I do not believe he has gone far enough. And particularly in relation to Chagos, I deplore that. I wrote Lawless World in 2005. I suggested that Britain and the United States had turned their backs on the rule of law paradigm in international relations and multilateralism. And I regret to say, and I wish I was wrong, that I was not wrong, that it has become even worse. And that unless those two countries get themselves back on that road, we are truly entering into a lawless world situation. I am not optimistic, because the United States, if it withdraws from the system that it has created, as it certainly did under the previous administration of Mr. Trump, leaves the world bereft of a flag bearer. Let me finish with one final thought, given the Nuremberg legacy and the irony of the situation that we now have. If you were to ask me, which is the flag bearer for the idea of the rule of law in international relations, the country that I would point to is Germany. How ironic that 75 years after the Nuremberg judgment, it is the country of the defendants that is defending the idea of the rule of law and human rights and international criminal justice. It is Germany that is prosecuting ISIS perpetrators in northern Iraq and Syria, not the United Kingdom, not the United States. That is one of the legacies of Nuremberg that we all really need to think about.
Okay, let me go back to the indictment and to East-West Street and to the tension between crimes against humanity and genocide. And I think what you make in the book, I think what's remarkable about the book is that you are able to basically use these legal categories as vehicles or vessels for really world ideologies. So you basically, they are like shorthand expressions of philosophy about the state of the world, about the interest of minority groups, about whether it's the individual or the group. So I have two questions for you in that regard. One, does one have to choose? I mean, is it really a matter of choosing, or is it really a matter of complementing the two ideas? I mean, dealing with criminality from the group's perspective doesn't come at the expense of dealing with criminality from the individual expense. And secondly, I think you've been involved in recent months in another project, Philippe. We're following you, and that is the attempt to generate a new crime, which is the crime of ecocide. And the question is whether what would you say is the philosophy that underpins that idea, and whether you would hope that it would have the same traction that genocide and crimes against humanity had in 1945.
Thank you, Yuval. Well, I mean, we could talk for hours, literally, on crimes against humanity and genocide. Just for those who are not as schooled as you and Renana and others, perhaps on the call, the difference between crimes against humanity and genocide is that crimes against humanity is essentially focused on the protection of the individual and the rights of the individual. And the crime of genocide is focused on the protection of groups. Lauter Pact opted for the protection of individuals, that we treat and protect human beings because they are human beings, not because they're a member of a group. Lemkin said, well, that's a great idea, but the reality is, and of course Lemkin is right, people get targeted not because of things they've done individually, but because they happen to be a member of a group that is hated from its particular moment in time and place. And therefore, if you want to protect individual human beings, the law must protect groups. No, says Lauter Pact, if you focus on the protection of groups, you will replace the tyranny of states with the tyranny of groups. And my own practice, cases I've done in the former Yugoslavia, tends to support Lauter Pact, and I think he was right. I think the genocide as a concept, totally understandable and totally brilliant, nevertheless has had the unintended consequence of reinforcing group identity, and I fear giving rise to the very horrors it was intended to prevent. Law is full of unintended consequences. Renana and Yuval have read East-West Street attentively. They know that intellectually I am with Lauter Pact. But, and East-West Street ends in a place of mass murder. 3,500 Jews killed on a single day, the 25th of March, 1943, just outside the small town of Zhovka near Lviv, Lemberg. I was there yesterday morning with the Ukrainian judge of the European Court of Human Rights who wanted to see it, who wanted to stand there with me, to understand what it was that I was feeling. Incidentally, the Ukrainian judge at the European Court of Human Rights is the only Jewish judge right now on the European Court. And we were there together. And every time I've been there, it is impossible for me not to feel the pull of kinship, of association, of feeling of belonging with the Lauterpachs and the Flaschners and the Buchholzes, my family, who lie in that mass grave. And of course, when I'm there and subsequently and forever, I'm with Lemkin. I understand what Lemkin was doing. And so I don't make a choice. Eventually, the two concepts live together, but they go to a fundamental question of identity. Who am I? Do I wish to be defined by the fact that I am white, male, British, Jewish, an Arsenal football supporter, whatever? Or do I wish to be identified for the protective purposes of the law just as a human being? And that's the debate, and one that is resonant for everyone who's on this call, because everyone knows what I'm talking about, because we all feel a pull in multiple directions. And that's why these two extraordinary human beings, who with the passage of time, I feel are ever more brilliant, is remarkable. And that is related actually to Ecocide. Yuval knows, when I had the great happiness of working with him when he was doing his PhD, and in the many years subsequently, when he was Dean of the Hebrew University, which I visited with great happiness many times, I got my start in the 80s working in the field of the environment. Chernobyl was really the incident that caused me to start thinking about the environment. So I've always been interested, I've always taught about it, I've always written about it, but international criminal law sort of took over. Last November, I received a request to chair a working group on a fifth international crime. There have only been four since 1945, and that's one of the legacies of Nuremberg. It gave us the four international crimes, but there have been no new ones since then. And the thing about the four crimes, waging illegal war, crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes, is that they all are intended to protect the human being, which of course is totally understandable. There are no international crimes that are intended to protect the environment as such. And Ecocide is intended to fill that gap at a time of maximal need, whether it's biodiversity or the climate system or oceans or whatever it is. I think we need crimes, a crime that criminalizes people who destroy the environment intentionally or unintentionally on a massive scale. And there's a lot of support now for the idea of Ecocide, and I think it will happen. I think the only issue is when, not if. But again, my involvement in this project, with which I now seem to be associated, and am happily associated, is to honor Lauterpacht and Lemkin. Frankly, when I got that invitation, I thought back to Lauterpacht and Lemkin. Both men didn't yet know they had lost their entire families in the horrors of that period, 1933 to 1945. They would find out in 1946, in the middle of the trial, what had happened. What did they do? Did they go into a corner, curl up, and weep? No, they did not. What they did is so deeply inspiring to me. They did what they knew best. They wrote, they generated ideas, they invented, and they went to governments and said, let us out of this horror find a sliver of light. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And let's do something positive for the future. And it has been remarkable to me what the reaction to that has been. You know, in 2 weeks' time, I will go to the opening at the Imperial War Museum of their new Second World War and Holocaust galleries. And the reason I've been invited is that one of the exhibits is to honor Lauterpacht and Lemkin, that out of the horrors of that period came the Nuremberg trial and came these ideas of these two remarkable lawyers, Jewish, Polish lawyers. And so for me, one of the legacies of Lauterpacht and Lemkin and the Nuremberg trial is precisely the work I've been doing in the last few months on Ecocide, and doing it, frankly, because my kids say to me, Dad, this is important for us. This is one of the most important things for us now. Please get involved.
I want to jump in and bring together several of your answers or of our questions. So it's hard to ignore the fact that both ecocide and genocide are inventions. They're essentially neologisms and they're metaphors for something. And it brings back, at least from my own private perspective, the question of the stories that we tell about the law and how impactful is this story. And when I listen to your passionate portrayal of these two men, Lauterbach and Lemkin, you can sense the antinomy between them, the rational person, the individualist or the universalist versus the Jew, the Mensch. Both of them were Jews and both of them were Mensches, but and it takes me back to one of my greatest interests in Nuremberg, and it's the story that Nuremberg left us with. And that's the story that reason overcomes vengeance. Now, I'm not talking about the vengeance of killing all the Nazis, as was suggested previous to the Nuremberg trial, but even within the trial, even when the trial came with the upper hand, the decision of the trial took place already and unfolded. Vengeance in the sense of the emotions of people that lost all their families was completely delegitimized. And even when you described the reaction of Lemkin and Lauterbach, you said, what would they do? Curl up and cry? No, maybe they should stand up and do something. And they did, they wrote, but there are other ways to take and we completely disacknowledge them. And if I tie it back to the question of the war on terror and the lawless world that unfolded, maybe we should give at least some legitimacy to the feelings of vengeance, to the rage, to the anti-rational response to mass atrocity that is simply to be very angry, especially when we face ecocide.
Yeah. No, I mean, Renana, I'm so pleased you've asked this. There's so many different ways we can get into this. Let me just share briefly the anecdote. Last week, I interviewed Ben Ferencz for a BBC Radio 4 program that I'm making that will be broadcast in a couple of weeks on the 75th anniversary of Nuremberg and the legacy. And Ben was just hilarious. I mean, Rabbi Jessica, you're aware. He said, yeah, we met Lemkin. He was a total pain in the ass. He just was a troublemaker. He would come and irritate us and he would say genocide. And we just wanted to carry on prosecuting real crimes, not all of these crazy ideas that he had, but they loved him. He was absolutely remarkable. There was no forum for victims at Nuremberg. There was no way for victims to address the court. And that was partly because it took the Anglo-Saxon model. Let me share a little anecdote, which I think is on point and quite entertaining, because I think these things are culturally specific. The British and the Americans led the design of a tribunal in which, why would you give a voice to victims? What place do they have in legal process? In 1998, I spent the summer in Rome, and I was on the delegation of a small Pacific island state, Solomon Islands. And I was charged with drafting a number of parts of it with Andrew Clapham and others, good friends of mine. One of them was the preamble. Unbelievably, we drafted the preamble on our own and no one checked it. And the preamble in the text is the one that Andrew and I wrote, basically two teenage guys. It was absolutely crazy. But I also got involved in what became Article 73, which is different from Nuremberg. Article 73 is intended to give a voice to victims. Or it was draft Article 73. I can't remember how it was actually adopted in the end. But it's in the text. Basically, there will be a forum and there'll be a victim support service and allow the voice of the victims, the rage of the victims, the vengeance desire of the victim. I, in Rome, was on the little negotiating group for the article, it was draft Article 73. And I said, well, I look back on it and I really think, what was I up to? But I was up to my own cultural predilections. As an English barrister, why would you want to hear from the victims in court? That's not what English courts do. That's not what common law courts do. And I'll never forget the delegate from Austria, of all countries. I, who have a mother born in July 1938, 3 months after the Anschluss, who was on the receiving end of the largesse of people like Otto Vesta here in Vienna, where I'm speaking from. I remember the Austrian delegate saying to me, Philippe, it's outrageous, you're against victims. And I remember pausing and thinking, wow, that's interesting. I'm being told by the Austrian delegate I'm against victims. I don't think of myself as being against victims. I think of myself, I'm creating this whole system, which is precisely intended. But Renana, you're right. You're right. Nuremberg did not. And I look back almost with a sense of shame and watch on YouTube the treatment of witnesses. I'm thinking of Samuel Reisman, who was one of the only survivors of Treblinka. And you see how he's questioned in court. And it just is so painful to watch this man who unbelievably survived Treblinka, where my own great-grandmother and Lemkin's parents perished, and you see him being not treated gently and with respect and allowed to give his own voice. So you are absolutely right on that. Let me just mention one other anecdote. Storytelling is at the heart of what I'm doing. Why? I'm proud to be a part of the international law community. I love the international law community, but I've learned that it is not enough as an international lawyer to speak only to the international law community. You have to reach a wider audience if you really want to make things work. For me, what was done in 45 was hugely important. And most people out there don't know about it. And what makes me extraordinarily happy is that East-West Street is now translated into 30 languages and has sold something approaching 500,000 copies. There are not 500,000 international lawyers in the world. And that means the message about the vital importance of the Nuremberg legacy, the reason we're doing this call with the Rat Line, which is an outgrowth of East-West Street, is that people are beginning to realize that what happened in 1945 was nothing short of miraculous and revolutionary in changing the world and saying governments cannot treat people in this particular way. But on vengeance, some of you have read the Rat Line, and you will know that my feeling is that there were two theories about how Vesta died in horrible pain on his own in a Vatican-run hospital. One is that he contracted leptospirosis while swimming in a river. And the other is that he was poisoned by persons unknown, which is his son's theory. I think the evidence generally points to him having contracted leptospirosis. And then 2 months ago, from Jerusalem, I received an email. I received an email from a reasonably well-known writer and literary person who runs a literary journal. And he says, "Dear Philippe, I read your book with great interest, loved it, blah, 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 very important. Let me tell you about my father-in-law, my late father-in-law, who passed away only in 2019. His name was Sergio Minerbi. Sergio Minerbi was born in Rome in the 1920s. He was hidden during the Nazi occupation of Rome in a convent, and he survived. In 1945, he went to Palestine. And after the State of Israel was created, he began to work for Mossad. And in late 1948, he was sent back to Rome. And his job was to keep an eye out on the Austrian bishop, Alois Yuval, who had helped Mengele, Priebke, Eichmann, Wächter, and others. And Sergio Minerbi returned to Israel in August 1949, 3 weeks after Wächter died. Mission accomplished. I was astonished when this man from Jerusalem sent me Sergio Minerbi's memoir, and he describes what he did in relation to checking on Yuval. But he couldn't remember, because by then he was in his 90s, exactly what they'd all got up to. He was part of a 4-man hit squad sent from Israel to go and track Nazis. So he asked, in writing his memoir, whether they would open the archive so that he could check the documents that had been received back from Italy about what they had done, and permission was refused. So right now I'm in a correspondence with a fellow who wrote a very nice review of East-West Street in Haaretz. That fellow, unbelievably, is now the president of Israel, Bougie Herzog, about whether we can open the files and find out what Sergio Minerbi did and did not do in Rome in the spring and summer of 1949. And I have to tell you, as I wrote in the Rat Line, my late and wonderful next door neighbor, the spy writer John Le Carre, said he thinks Vesta was killed. And he thinks Vesta was killed by the Israelis or by the Jews. And he thinks that, and Le Carre said to me, and that would be a damn good thing too. So I think, Renana, watch this space. These stories take different directions. I'm not, just to be very clear, I'm not suggesting that people go out and poison people they wish to get rid of. I'm a lawyer, I'm subject to my rules of professional responsibility. I'm not saying that, just to be absolutely clear. But how would we feel if it turned out that dear Sergio Minerbi, in fact, did get up to something? I just leave that question hanging, Renana. You're pushing at an open door.
And I think you have the title of your next book.
No, I mean, it's funny that you raised Herzog, because Lauterbach part was his great uncle. So that everything really comes together in our small shtetl.
Yuval, can I jump in 1 second?
Sure.
Because I want to raise something that I think we witness happen and happens with Nuremberg, and maybe you can address why the Nuremberg brings this out. There's the Nuremberg Lamala and there's the Nuremberg Lamata. So Lamala is like the heavenly, the majestic, where Philippe, I think, dwells on a lot in his, just the way he articulates. And this is so personal and professional. And then there's the Lamata, which I think Renana dwells in, which, like, how do you deal with like these massive crimes in a way that you impact the world today? And you can hear it even in the way you call each other out and where you focus and what you do. And I just want to point out, because it epitomizes what Philippe said about like the crack letting the light in. On this Zoom today are two people I just want to point out. Rabbi Klasfeld, who was 8 years old when I came to Bethel 19 years ago, who is now in law school at University of Miami, who heard his temple had brought Ben Ferenc and figured out a way to get this 100-year-old man down to University of Miami Law School before COVID, so that this next generation of up-and-coming lawyers could witness face-to-face history. And then we have someone I haven't even met yet, but who is on the call as well, Lori Passler, who after her father died, discovered he had been in the Nuremberg courtroom, had a stack of documents this high, and started an organization, Courtroom 600 in Chicago, about Nuremberg. And I want to ask the three of you, why does Nuremberg do this in a way other trials and other spaces haven't, where there's such resonance, where you can have this like majestic kind of, just unbelievable Lamala space that Philippe dwells in, and also like the concrete, like Renana and Yuval, and showing us like the world didn't learn its lesson. We're still witnessing things today. What is it? What is that special sauce of Nuremberg?
Over to Yuval and Renana first. Well, come on, let's hear from them.
Well, it's the mother of all trials, of course. I mean, it's the first of its kind. I mean, you really didn't have anything close to that, and you never had anything close to that afterwards. I mean, taking the 24 leaders of a country, putting them on the dock, trying them for crimes of an unprecedented nature. I mean, this is really, this project, I mean, really tests the outer boundary of where the law really ends and where something larger than the law actually begins. And I think we are still grappling, all of us who practice law and international law are still grappling with the limits of what can we achieve, how, what social justice can we achieve with the law. And I think Nuremberg and the drama of Nuremberg really confronts us with this existential question. is there a place where the law really ends and you have to think of something else, something which is larger than life? I mean, this would be the equivalent for in the world of international law.
And if I can only add again from my Lemata perspective, and I really love these metaphors of the Lemata and the Lemala, that in Nuremberg and in many respects also in the Eichmann trial, and because of that maybe the Eichmann trial is very much up there in the majestic levels in some respects, they knew how to tell a story. And not only that they knew, it was really important for them to tell us the story. Prosecutor Jackson was guided, but what would be the legacy? He thought of what would be the legacy. He wanted to shape it. And also Prosecutor Hausner in the Eichmann trial. The story was just as important as the trial itself, as the consequences of the trial itself. It was part of it, what we call today the didactic or the pedagogic objective, but it was just the story. And I think that one of the things we're missing today in international criminal law is the story. We're lacking a story. And whether it's because we're focusing on African leaders or maybe because we're focusing on, on the realities of international law and not on these great stories, but it's really hard to captivate this, to capture the hearts and the minds of people when you don't have this big story, for better or worse. So, because stories also have risks and hazards in them.
Yeah. Well, I'm with both of you. I mean, it was a revolutionary moment. I go back to Jay's words at the beginning. This had never happened before. This is the most famous trial in human history, basically, and nothing like this had happened. And it was the symbolism. A symbolism that opens the imagination about what is possible when there is political will. And that was brought home to me in November 2019. I was in Washington. I was doing a seminar at George Washington Law School with my dear friend, Thomas Bergenthal, the former American judge at the International Court of Justice, a wonderful man. And it was a month before we were going to have hearings in a case brought by a small African country, the Gambia, against Myanmar, Burma, for allegations of genocide perpetrated by the Myanmar authorities, the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar army, against the Rohingya Muslim community. And the thing you need to understand about Thomas Bergenthal is, apart from being an ace human being and a brilliant lawyer, is Tom was at Auschwitz. Tom was one of the children who was being cared for, shall we say, by Joseph Mengele, literally, in that little group of children. And he survived, obviously. And at a certain point in the seminar, Tom said to me in conversation publicly in the seminar, can you imagine, Philippe, if in 1944, when I was at Auschwitz, a small country far away in the world went to an international court, like the Gambia did against Myanmar, and brought a case against Germany and said, you cannot do this. Can you imagine how amazing that would have been? And that could not happen in 1944 because there was no court and there were no rules. Today we have those courts and today we have those rules. And that's in large part because of Nuremberg. They are far from perfect. We know that. We are not starry-eyed about the Nuremberg judgment. We're not starry-eyed about the Nuremberg trial and process. We're not starry-eyed about international law. We know it's a long game, but it offers hope. And hope is a remarkable thing.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you have a last question or thought that the three of you want to end with before our program concludes.
I'll just say, I mean, it's just a real privilege and a happiness to be part of your program. I think taking forward the legacy of Nuremberg is a fine, important, and wonderful thing. You can count on all of you, my complete support going forward. And as you said, Rabbi Jessica, the generation we care about the most is the young ones, because that generation that lived through those years and that trial will soon no longer be with us. And that remarkable storytelling ability of people who were there is about to disappear. And that imposes, I think, on those of us who happen to know what happened, because we've spoken to so many people, a big responsibility to carry the torch going forward.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We move mountains to get everyone to meet their flight needs and their hotel needs. And we just can't thank everyone for making time to be with us, to speak. All of those who have joined us this morning, this is recorded as well, so others will be able to see it. I just can't thank you enough. I can't thank American Friends of Hebrew University enough for being our partners in this and bringing Raton and Yuval and Daphna into this conversation. You added so incredibly much. And we're just so appreciative. God willing, Philippe, you'll be here with us in person one day. That's our dream down the line, for sure. And we can all be together in person. Philippe made an incredible documentary. I think it's called What Our Fathers Did, or A Nazi Legacy. Google it. It's amazing. And it will mean so much more after having heard him speak this day. The Holocaust is subject not just of many documentaries, but of many movies as well, including a movie called Women in Gold. And if our awesome producers, Aileen and Amanda, will share our next slide, this Thursday, not Ryan Reynolds, who played him in the movie Woman in Gold, but the actual lawyer behind the story of the recovered Klimt painting that had been taken during the Holocaust. E. Randall Schoenberg from USC is a law professor at USC in California. The hugely successful movie Woman in Gold was made about the case he brought to get the Klimt painting returned rightly to the family that had it stolen from them during the Holocaust. He is our guest this Thursday. That event is free. For all of you who registered today, your copy of Ratline will arrive in the mail in the next few weeks. You will Philippe's attention to detail is awesome and unbelievable. The podcast, I've been told, is excellent as well. And just keep telling these stories and talking about them and hearing them. Again, we're going to share the CLEs for those of you who are attorneys who get those today. And we just wish that everyone stays safe and well and good. And God willing, we can be in person together very soon. We want to thank all our sponsors and our underwriters, the Weinbergs, for all of this, and just have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you everyone so much for being with us. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.